The wine glass trembled slightly in Dan Harper's hand as he stared at his wife, her lips curled into that familiar, condescending smirk. Laughter rang through their cold, luxurious apartment. Loren's laughter. "You're nothing without me," she said, swirling the red liquid in her glass. Her tone was light, casual, as if stating a universal truth. "You'll never leave, Dan, because without me, you have nothing." The words hit harder than any slap could. But Dan didn't react. He had spent years perfecting the art of silence, swallowing every insult, every jab, every moment she made him feel like a ghost in his own life. Loren was beautiful, successful, and ruthless. And somewhere along the way, she had decided that her husband was nothing more than a shadow of herself. Dan had believed it too, once, but not anymore. He set his glass down, stood up, and walked toward the bedroom. He could feel Loren's eyes on his back, expecting him to argue, to defend himself, to beg. But tonight, there would be no fight. Tonight, he would begin his disappearing act. Loren barely noticed the empty side of the bed when she rolled over the next morning. The absence of warmth was nothing new. She stretched, yawning, before reaching for her phone. No messages. Strange. Dan was predictable, like clockwork. Even when they fought, he always texted some pathetic check-in or an attempt at conversation. A sigh escaped her lips as she walked to the kitchen, but when she reached for the coffee machine, she hesitated. The ceramic mug she always used, the one Dan handed her every morning without fail, wasn't there. The kitchen felt and touched. Her brows furrowed. Her eyes flickered toward the key rack. His car keys gone. A creeping unease crawled up her spine. She picked up her phone, dialing his number. Straight to voicemail. Loren exhaled sharply. "Pathetic," she muttered, shaking her head. "He's sulking." She poured herself coffee and sat down at the dining table, scrolling through her social media. If Dan wanted to play his little disappearing act for a few hours, fine. Let him. Except a few hours turned into a whole day. By evening, she was annoyed. By nightfall, she was concerned. She tried calling him again. Nothing. She checked their joint bank account. Except it wasn't joint anymore. The cards he used for their expenses were all blocked. That's when the panic set in. For the first time, a terrible thought crossed her mind. What if he wasn't coming back? The millstone, the 13th row. For 52107, Loren paced across the apartment, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The silence was unbearable. She had always thought she could handle solitude. After all, wasn't she the one in control? Wasn't she the one who called the shots? But now, with Dan gone, an eerie emptiness clung to every corner of the space. She grabbed her phone and tried calling him again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Her stomach tightened. Where the hell was he? Her fingers moved instinctively to her banking app, but the moment the screen loaded, her breath caught. The account she had shared with Dan, gone. The credit cards he paid off every month declined. Her own balance was fine, but there was a glaring, undeniable absence of the financial cushion she had always relied on. She scoffed. "All right, Dan, cute trick." But as the minutes stretched into hours, as messages to their mutual friends went unanswered, that trick started to feel like something else. This wasn't Dan sulking. This wasn't Dan waiting for her to call him back and apologize. This was Dan gone. By the third day, Loren's patience had morphed into full-blown anxiety. She hadn't wanted to believe it at first, but something was very, very wrong. Dan had erased himself. His email? Deactivated. His social media? Wiped clean. Even the damn office had no idea where he was. His boss said he'd resigned, effective immediately. That wasn't like him. Dan was predictable, steady, safe. He didn't do this. She sat at the kitchen table, tapping her nails against the surface, a glass of wine untouched beside her. Loren had never doubted for a second that Dan needed her. He always came back, no matter how hard she pushed. Because he was weak. Because he was nothing without her. So why did it feel like she was the one unraveling? The apartment, once a symbol of everything she had built, felt cavernous. The sharp scent of his cologne had faded. His usual coffee mug still sat in the sink from the last morning he had been there, when she had laughed at him, dismissed him, told him he was nothing. She had won that fight. By the end of the week, Loren's panic had turned into a slow-burning fury. She refused to be abandoned, not like this. She tried calling their mutual friends again. This time, someone answered. It was the woman, Dan's ever-loyal best friend. Where is he? Lauren demanded, skipping all pleasantries. A long pause. Then Sam's voice, cool and detached. Why do you care? Lauren gritted her teeth. Because he's my husband, and he's acting like a damn fugitive. Don't play games with me, Sam. Sam laughed, a slow, knowing laugh. Funny, Lauren. I thought Dan was nothing without you. The words hit harder than she wanted to admit. Tell me where he is, Lauren hissed, voice low. Sam's voice turned serious. He doesn't want to be found. A sharp pang twisted in Lauren's chest. He wouldn't. He did. Lauren's throat tightened. For the first time, she realized something terrifying. She hadn't lost a man who needed her. She had lost a man who had finally realized he didn't. Millstone, 13.3.20.25.11. Lauren sat in the center of their king-size bed, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the emptiness around her. The sheets still smelled faintly of Dan, though the scent was fading, much like the certainty she once had that he would come crawling back. The days had turned into a week, then two. Every passing day chipped away at her confidence, replacing it with something foreign, something she wasn't ready to name. She had called his family. They were polite but distant, as if she were a stranger asking about a man they barely knew. His colleagues had no answers. His name had disappeared from every document, every employee roster, like he had never even existed. The power dynamic between them had shifted in a way she had never considered possible. Dan was gone, completely gone, and for the first time, she felt the weight of those words. At first, she had refused to acknowledge the fear creeping into her chest. She went on as usual, brunches with the wives of executives, Pilates classes, dinners where she smiled through conversations but barely heard a word. But something had changed. She used to feel in control, above them all. She had the perfect life, the perfect husband, a man who belonged to her. Now she could see the glances, the whispers behind champagne glasses, the smirks when someone casually asked, "How's Dan doing?" They knew. She had never outright said Dan had left her, but people could sense things, and in their world, a woman abandoned was a woman exposed. She had always imagined herself untouchable. Now she was a walking target. The worst part, she had no real response to their silent judgment because she had nothing left to show. One evening, she sat down to open their joint email account, one of the few places Dan hadn't erased himself from. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she typed in a subject line. Talk to me. She hesitated before hitting send, telling herself she wasn't desperate, this wasn't begging, she was simply demanding an explanation. A response came within minutes. Her breath hitched. He clicked. Undelivered message. He had blocked her, her hands curled into fists. Dan had always been the passive one, the quiet one. He let her lead, let her shape their life. And now he was the one shutting her out. The anger burned away the emptiness, giving her something to hold on to. Fine, if he wanted to disappear, she would find him. The search led her to a name she had always treated as a nuisance. Sam Brooks. She arrived at Sam's apartment unannounced, her sharp heels clicking against the pavement as she stalked toward the front door. She knocked. No answer. She knocked harder. Finally, the door swung open, revealing Sam. Barefoot, wearing an old t-shirt and sweatpants, her dark hair piled into a messy bun. She didn't look surprised to see Lauren, only mildly irritated. "Lauren," she said, leaning against the doorframe, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Cut the crap, Sam. Where is he?" Sam didn't flinch. "You should go home." Lauren let out a humorless laugh. "So this is how it is? You're covering for him? I know he's been here." Sam raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" Lauren narrowed her eyes. "You always wanted this, didn't you? You always hated that he was with me." Sam sighed, shaking her head. "You really are something else, Lauren." Lauren stepped forward. "Tell me where he is, Sam. Now." Something in Sam's face shifted. The amusement disappeared, replaced by something cold and sharp. You don't get it, do you?" Sam said quietly. "Dan doesn't want to be found." Lauren's stomach twisted, but she pushed through. "I don't believe you." Sam studied her for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Fine. Come in." Lauren hesitated before walking inside. The apartment was warm, lived in, a stark contrast to her cold, polished home. Sam disappeared into the kitchen and returned a moment later with her phone. She tapped the screen a few times before holding it out. Lauren's heart pounded. A photo. Millstone, 13.00, 13.5.111. Dan, sitting on a dock, sunlight glinting off the water behind him. He looked different. relaxed, at peace, alive in a way she hadn't seen in years. Loren stared at the image, her fingers tightening around the phone. "Where is this?" Sam pulled the phone back. "Somewhere you can't reach." Loren's chest constricted. He wasn't coming back. For the first time, she truly understood what Dan had done. He hadn't just left her, he had left the version of himself that needed her. And that was the real loss. Millstone, 13.5, 2025-21. Loren barely recognized herself anymore. Her once meticulously planned days were unraveling into a blur of unanswered calls, restless nights, and an apartment that suddenly felt too big. She had built a life where she was always in control of Dan, of their home, of the way the world perceived them. But now that control was slipping through her fingers, and the harder she tried to grasp it, the more it eluded her. Dan wasn't playing a game. He wasn't testing her patience, waiting for her to beg. He was truly, irrevocably gone. She sat at the dining table, the untouched plate of food in front of her already cold. The silence stretched, pressing against her ears. She had spent years wishing Dan would just shut up, stop whining, stop needing things from her. Now, she couldn't stand the quiet. It was suffocating. She tried to distract herself. She went shopping, swiping her card at designer boutiques, stuffing bags into the trunk of her car like they could somehow fill the void Dan had left behind. She met friends for brunch, sipping overpriced mimosas while pretending to care about their shallow gossip. She threw herself into work, making sure to look flawless, untouchable, unbothered. But none of it worked. The moment she stepped into the apartment, reality came crashing down again. The empty side of the closet, the unmade bed that only she slept in now, the kitchen counter where Dan had once stood every morning making her coffee. Black, 2 sugars, just the way she liked it. She had mocked how predictable he was. She had rolled her eyes at how easily he settled into routines. Now she would give anything to hear the sound of the coffee maker humming at dawn. The worst part wasn't the loneliness. It was the humiliation. People had started talking. She wasn't stupid. She saw the way people glanced at her during dinner parties, the way whispers traveled faster than the wine being poured. Loren Harper, the woman who thought she was untouchable, had been left behind. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. She was supposed to be the one calling the shots. If anyone left, it should have been her. She should have been the one with a newer, younger lover, moving on effortlessly while Dan wallowed in self-pity. But he wasn't suffering. She was. The rage crept in before she could stop it. Dan had no right to do this. To disappear, to erase himself, to make her feel like she was the one who had lost. She refused to let him have the last word. If he thought he could just walk away and live some quiet, peaceful life while she sat here, drowning in silence and shame, he was wrong. Loren wasn't the type to sit back and accept things. She was going to remind Dan exactly who she was, and she knew just how to do it. She started with the lawyer. Loren had always assumed their marriage would last, not because it was perfect, but because it was hers to control. So they had never signed a prenup. Dan was too soft to ever demand one, and she had always believed he was too weak to leave. That mistake was going to cost him. Sitting in her lawyer's office, she crossed her legs, her manicured fingers tapping impatiently against the armrest of the chair. "I want everything I'm entitled to," she said coolly. "His savings, his investments, whatever he left behind, I want it." Her lawyer, a woman just as sharp as she was, nodded. Dan already filed for divorce, so he's a step ahead. But given the financial records, you might have a strong case for spousal support. If you can prove he left you in an unfair position. Loren laughed. "Unfair position?" she scoffed. "I made that man. Every cent he ever earned, every friend he had, every bit of social standing, that was me." She deserved compensation. She deserved to make him pay. If he thought disappearing meant he could be free, he was about to learn otherwise. She tried to track him down. Private investigators. Bank records. Calls to his old job. Dan was thorough, too thorough. There were no loose ends, no breadcrumbs leading back to him. Millstone, 13, 35, 20, the 21. But then, finally, a lead. A bank transaction. It wasn't just a small withdrawal from an ATM in a town she barely recognized. But it was something. And Loren, she wasn't about to let him slip away. She packed a bag that night. Because if Dan thought he could live a life without her, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. Millstone, 13.03.22.25.23. Loren pulled up to the small, unremarkable town just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The streets were quiet, the kind of place people came to disappear. She had spent weeks chasing shadows, trying to track Dan down, and now, finally, she was here. Her nails drummed against the steering wheel as she parked outside the modest cafe where his last transaction had been recorded. It was nothing like the sleek, high-end places they used to frequent. No valet, no overpriced cocktails, no desperate social climbers trying to impress the right people. It was ordinary. Something Dan had never been, not really. She stepped inside, the door jingling as she entered. A woman behind the counter looked up, smiling politely. "Evening," she said, "looking for someone?" Loren smoothed down the front of her designer coat, scanning the cafe. "Dan Harper," she said. "He's been here, hasn't he?" The woman's smile faltered slightly. "I wouldn't know. People come and go." Loren narrowed her eyes. "He's my husband." The woman hesitated, then sighed. "Look, lady, if he's running from you, maybe you should let him go." Loren's fingers curled into fists. "Where is he?" The woman shook her head. "Even if I knew, I wouldn't tell you." Loren clenched her jaw, her breath shallow with frustration. She had come too far to be turned away by some nobody in a roadside cafe. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw him. Through the large front window, past the rows of parked cars. He was there. Dan, he was leaning against a truck, laughing at something. Actually laughing. His posture was loose, relaxed. He looked different, lighter, like he had shed something heavy and had no intention of picking it back up. And standing beside him was Sam. Loren's stomach twisted. They weren't touching, but the ease between them was undeniable. Sam said she had only helped him escape, that she wasn't a threat. Liar. Loren shoved the cafe door open and stepped onto the pavement. Dan turned, and their eyes met. For the briefest moment, surprise flickered across his face. But it wasn't the shock she had been hoping for. It wasn't fear. It was pity. That stung more than any insult ever could. "Lorena," he said simply. She crossed her arms, tilting her chin up. "So this is what you've been doing, playing house in some backwater town?" Dan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not playing anything, Loren. I'm just living." "With her?" Loren snapped, jerking her head towards Sam. Sam didn't flinch, didn't even bother responding. She simply stepped aside, giving Dan space to handle the conversation himself. That, more than anything, infuriated Loren. Dan never handled things himself. He let her take charge, let her decide, let her steer their life. So why was he standing here now, looking at her like she was just a piece of his past he had already let go of? "You ran from me," Loren said, voice shaking slightly. "You blocked me out, left me with nothing." Dan studied her for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Loren frowned as he handed it to her. She unfolded it. "Divorce settlement." Her stomach dropped. "You're serious," Dan exhaled. "I should have left a long time ago, Loren. But I didn't because I thought I needed you. I thought I was nothing without you." His eyes softened. "But I was wrong." Loren's hands shook. "So that's it? You're just walking away? Just like that?" Dan smiled. Small, sad. "I already did." She opened her mouth, but nothing came out, because for the first time in her life, she had lost